Right. All right, we're going to get started. We are on, if you would turn to page 36, we're going to be looking at texts and versions of the Bible. You may be aware, probably are, that there are a lot of different versions out there of the Bible. So we thought that some information about how the Bible got to us would be interesting to you. And also, if you're really trying to embark on seriously reading the Bible, you might appreciate some guidance on versions, because there's a lot of different English versions available. So there's a chart here that's trying to fall down. I'll just stand here and hold it up. This is usually up front in our shop area, so if you come in some other time, it'll be up there and you can look at it any time.
Right at the entrance.
But this describes, as you can see, a whole bunch of different versions. So I'm not going to read this to you. You're welcome to come and take a look at it later on, unless you can read it from where you are. Eyes better than mine, maybe.
The only ones I can see is the Bible translations. Here.
So the question is, how do we get the Bible? How does it come to us? Well, it started, of course, with somebody, Moses or David or Paul or Matthew, writing something down with pen and ink on a papyrus or a parchment, because that's what they had. That was the only thing they had available. So it's handwritten, called a manuscript. And the originals then were copied. And then the copies were copied. And the copies of the copies were copied. And so on, for a long time, for centuries. So you end up with a large number of these copies after a period of centuries. Some of them have one part of the Bible, some of them have something else. Now, as you might guess, when you're copying something by hand, it's possible for mistakes to happen, right? So a word might be left out. A whole line might be left out. A word, it might be, the scribe looks at the original and then he turns back and he writes down a different word than was in the original. Most of the mistakes are actually just spelling mistakes. So it's not too hard to figure out, those kind of things. But there are variations, and then of course, if a wrong word got in there, when a copy is made of that copy, then that wrong word might get carried forward, right? So the progress of the Old Testament and New Testament texts and some of the versions is in the chart on page 36. So we're going to walk through these diagrams, okay? And I'll kind of describe the process by which we got the Bibles that we have. So for the Old Testament, we'll start with the Old Testament. And you'll see there at the top of the little diagram, you have the original Hebrew manuscripts. So the prophets, the historians, the poets, they wrote an original manuscript in Hebrew. The copying of the Hebrew scriptures was done meticulously, painstakingly, with very, very stringent checking procedures to make sure that the text was accurately copied. But that went on for centuries, and as we've said, some mistakes creep in. Eventually, that meticulous copying process resulted in what's called the Masoretic text, and you'll see that kind of in the middle of that diagram, which was around 900 to 1000 AD. But meanwhile, starting earlier than that, there was a fellow named Jerome who translated the Old and New Testaments into Latin, and that became the Vulgate version that was the official version of the Catholic Church for many centuries. Eventually, that was in about 1600, that was translated into English in the Douay Rheims, And from 1600 until the middle of the 20th century, that was the official Catholic Bible. So it was translated from Latin, not from Hebrew, so it's kind of one stage removed. I should probably just mention that Jerome, just being one guy doing the translating, that's a little less accurate than when you have a committee of scholars that are comparing notes with each other. So there are some questionable aspects to that translation, and scholars in general, would say that it's not a flawless translation. So meanwhile, then, the Masoretic text gave rise to, it was used for the English King James Version in 1611. So that was the Protestant standard English Bible for centuries, also until kind of until the late 19th century and into the 20th century. All right, well, over on the right, you'll see that there's also, coming out of the meticulous copying for centuries, there's some other texts, right? So there's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Have you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Was that a familiar term? These were ancient manuscripts that were found in caves in Israel near the Dead Sea, that's where they got their name, in 1947. A few of them were found after that, but they were found starting in 1947. They are the oldest existing copies of the Old Testament that we have. They were done somewhere between 100 BC and 100 AD. So very, very ancient texts. And what's interesting is to take those texts and compare it to the Masoretic text, and there is very, very little difference. So there's a 900-year gap between those, but it just gives its testimony to how careful the copying was, that there's very, very few differences between those texts. There are some variations, and where there are variations, we started looking at, what else do we have available? Also in that little oval, there you can see the Septuagint, which is translated LXX, the Latin or Roman numeral for 70. Legend has it was 70 scholars who translated it. That's probably inaccurate. There are also manuscripts called Targums. Those were translations into Aramaic. Very loose translations, lots of commentary inserted along with the text. They're not considered terribly authoritative, but if lots of them support a particular reading, you might see, for instance, in the margin of your Bible, a reference to a Targum reading. The Septuagint, I should probably mention, was from about 250 BC. So that's long, long before the Masoretic text. So the Septuagint was translated into Greek in Egypt based on a very ancient Hebrew text, more ancient than anything else that we have. So that gives it some value. And we also have the testimony of Jesus and the apostles, who tended usually to quote from the Septuagint version, the Greek Old Testament of their time. So there's some reasons to trust the Septuagint. There's some other reasons to be a little cautious about it, and that includes the fact that it's not considered by scholars to be a very careful translation in some areas, so it's uneven. The quality of the translation is uneven. And also the quality of the copying was nowhere near as good as the copying that the rabbis did of the Hebrew texts. Quick question?
You mentioned Samuel, which was divided by the Septuagint?
Well, in Hebrew, 1st and 2nd Samuel was all one book. In what has come down to us, it's now 2 books. But that was more of a convenience thing than anything else, just to split the scroll into 2 parts. So.
It says it was divided by the Septuagint.
It's not divided by, well, the Septuagint version may have been the first one that split it. That's possible. I don't know. But the custom that has come to us is that it's divided.
What do
Yes.
these names represent?
I'm sorry?
What do these names represent? People or groups of?
Well, the Masoretic text, that's a group called the Masoretes that produced the Masoretic text. The Douay-Rheims, those are two people's names that they translated the Vulgate. The Vulgate was the name of the version. Jerome was the guy that wrote that. King James commissioned the translation of the King James Version. That's why it's named after him. Is that what you were asking
Yes,
about?
but how about Septuagint?
Septuagint?
Yeah. what is
That is a Greek form of the Latin for 70. That's why it's abbreviated LXX, the Roman numeral 70.
Okay. Yes, that's what I was wondering.
Okay.
Okay, so this sounds like a lot of variation, right? I mean, it sounds like you've got stuff all over the place. But in actual fact, when you boil it all down, we have a very consistent and very reliable text. It's not all over the map. Now, if all we had was the Targums, it'd be all over the map. There's an example that we have, available to us of what happens if you don't have the real careful copying. You get the things like the Targums. But what we have is a very reliable, very consistent text, basic text. And there are few enough variations that you, like most modern Bibles, will have in the footnotes right on the page. It'll give you the other possible readings, and it'll tell you, well, from this, the Septuagint says this, or it'll say, something else says this. Some of them will say Syriac. Those are typically the Targums. So, we get told about the variations. We have them printed in with our Bible, and they're not great. They're not severe variations. They're mostly very unimportant little things that don't affect the meaning very much. So we have a very high confidence, really, that the text of the Old Testament has come down to us very accurately. Larry?
Yeah, what was, of what they've translated so far, what was in the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as...
The Dead Sea Scrolls contain all of Isaiah, one entire Isaiah scroll, which is huge. It's mammoth. They include portions of every other book of the Old Testament except Esther. There's no remnant of Esther from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, obviously we have other sources, but not the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are also hundreds and hundreds of non-biblical books. So there was the sect that produces the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were an apocalyptic sect, so they wrote all these books about the end of the world and the coming of Messiah and the destruction of the wicked and the angels burning everything up, and lots and lots of that kind of material, as well as property transfer deeds and wedding records and just all kinds of stuff. It is thought that a lot of that stuff was ditched in those caves when the Romans were crushing the Jewish revolt in 66 to 70 AD. Although there is some evidence that some of the material had been there earlier. So those caves were being used as storage location before the Romans started charging through, but then at that time a whole bunch more got put.
Was there any relationship between the Essenes and the people?
It used to be thought so, but nowadays they do not believe that the Qumran sect was the Essenes. They believe that those are separate groups now. Today they call it the Qumran sect because they have found at Qumran, the location in Israel called Qumran, they have found this scriptorium and whatever, and right near there is where these caves were. But nobody knows anything about it, other than that it was clearly an apocalyptic, end of the world kind of thing. But it was a secret society. And so they didn't write down much about themselves. They wrote down their teachings.
And this secret society, when did they think they existed in?
About 100 BC to 100 AD.
Yeah, that's what you said. Right.
Okay, so I think I had finished up with the Old Testament. Time for us to move on and talk about the New Testament.
Paul?
Yes.
Over the Dead Sea Scrolls, the caves and stuff all washing away, so like that. It's been stated that sometimes they think maybe there was other caves that maybe just washed away and there's stuff maybe buried underneath. It's
right. And some of the some of the material that was in there was just completely unsalvageable. So we don't know what some of the stuff was that was in there. There was also in Jerusalem there's a museum called the Shrine of the Book that's all about this stuff, and they have it wasn't just the jars with the scrolls in them. There was also artifacts, so anything that was valuable, so coins, keys, locks for doors, all kinds of stuff was just like chucked into these caves to protect it from the Romans. There's just all kinds of stuff that's in there. So it's do you remember, do we have a book in our library about the Dead Sea Scrolls? I think we used to. So anybody that would like to follow up on it, I know I have one in my home library that I would be willing to loan. So if anybody wants to pursue the Dead Sea Scrolls further, it's quite interesting, actually. Well, in the case of the New Testament, so we get down to the New Testament, the copying and the checking procedures nowhere close to as rigorous as the Hebrew Old Testament. So lots more variation got introduced into the text of the New Testament than the Old Testament, which might be backwards from what you would think, because the Old Testament's older, right? So it ought to be further away, but it's not. It's the New Testament manuscripts that are give the textual critics the biggest headaches. The variation in the text is offset by the fact that we have thousands of them. There are 6,000 primary texts, plus partials and quotations, and sometimes lengthy quotations, and things from other books where they're mentioned. So there's well over 15,000 texts to work from. So this gives the scholars, of course, a huge amount to work with, which it's a lot of work, but you can assemble from, when you got that many old manuscripts, you can assemble a very, very believable basic text. So you can trace down and see, oh, this error got in here, and then all these copies have that error. But we can tell it's an error because we got 4,000 of them that don't have it, that don't have that error. So, that's the work of the textual critics for the New Testament, is to pull all that together. And the first guy to ever pull it all together was a guy named Erasmus in the early 16th century, so the early 1500s. And he pulled together all these Greek, it was literally the work of a lifetime. He spent his whole life on this, and he pulled together his best assembly of the Greek New Testament that he felt like he could do, and that became known as the Textus Receptus. So in the diagram at the bottom of page 36, you've got the original Greek manuscripts, you've got thousands of copies. Once again, coming off of that to the left is the Latin Vulgate, so Jerome did his thing there, and then from the Vulgate came the Douay Rheims. But down from the thousands of copies, you've got the Textus Receptus in 1516. Erasmus was the scholar who did that. Textus Receptus is just Latin for received text. So you might see it either way. And the received text, Erasmus's assembly, was what was used for the English King James Version of the Bible in 1611. But you can see, I'm sorry?
And that was
that's in Greek. Right, so that's in Greek. The only thing that's not Greek here is the Vulgate, that's Latin. Okay, so Jerome translated the Greek into Latin, and then that was translated into English. But all of these other ancient ones are all Greek. So you can see there's some other arrows coming out of those original Greek manuscripts, right? Way over on the right side, you've got additional ancient manuscripts. So when Erasmus was working, he's working in the era where, you know, the printing press is only about 60 years old when he's doing his work. He's working from scrolls, from manuscripts, well, from codexes also, the ancient books. So, he didn't have the internet. He didn't have available to him all of the texts that existed. So there are additional Greek manuscripts that he didn't have available. 1881, two guys named Westcott and Hort took the Textus Receptus. They also took a lot of those other ancient manuscripts, and they assembled what they believed was a more authoritative original Greek text. Nowadays, the Westcott and Hort text is not really considered to be quite the bee's knees that it was. It was considered in the late 19th century. It was hailed as a big breakthrough. Not given quite as much authority today, but as you can see from that diagram, a guy named Nessel came along a few years later, and he brought in the work of some additional scholars, not just Westcott and Hort, and he updated the Westcott and Hort text and became known as the Nessel text. And then way down in the 1970s, a fellow named Alland came along, and he started with the Nessel text, and he brought in additional ancient manuscripts, also the work of additional scholars, and so he put together what's called the Nessel-Alland text. And that's the one that is in primary use these days for most of the modern English translations. However, you'll see down there, I apologize for my wrangling up here. You'll see that the English translations down at the bottom, they also draw on the Textus Receptus. So that has not been discarded by any stretch of the imagination. It's still a primary source that translators use. I want to say...
I thought they went
yes,
back further than that, at 15, 16.
That's when Erasmus put together the Textus Receptus. So Jerome, for instance, in 382, or in the 300s, he was working just from whatever Greek texts that were available to him, Greek scrolls that were available at that time. But there wasn't a really, I mean, Jerome's work was considered the authoritative work until Erasmus came along. And then Erasmus did a much more scholarly job. I need to let you know that there is a lot of controversy over whether the Textus Receptus, the received text, or the Nessel-Alland should be used. Right in this room, to my certain knowledge, we have Bibles that go both ways. Some of them that use the Nessel-Alland and some of them that use the received text. And if you read any books or articles on textual criticism, you would be left with the impression that everything is up in the air, everything is controversial, they're fighting over this and that and the other and the other and the other. Well, the thing is that those books and articles concentrate on the places where there's controversy, not on the places where there's agreement. Somebody has counted, I don't know where they got it, but this tiny percentage that's mentioned here, I think your notebook actually mentions, there is 1/4% of the Greek text that is in any doubt. So it's really, really minuscule. So the big fights, and people are passionate about this. People make terrible accusations against each other over this. But it really is about a very, very small amount of text. So the bottom line is that we have a very high level of confidence in our Greek text as well. Well, that's great if you speak Hebrew and Greek, but I happen to be an English speaker, so how do we get the Bible in English? Well, our English Bible versions are created in 3 different ways. So there's the literal, sometimes called formal correspondence, sometimes called word for word, sometimes called exact. These kinds of translations, I think we're actually over on page 38 now in your book. So there's these literal word-for-word exact translations. There are dynamic equivalence translations, sometimes called thought for thought. In fact, that's terminology you'll see on this chart. They'll talk about thought for thought. And then there's paraphrases. So we're just going to look briefly at all 3 of those. Formal correspondence, or exact translations, attempt very hard to translate the source word for word into the target language. So one word in the source becomes one word in the target. Now that doesn't always work because languages aren't that similar to each other, but that's what they try for. What that means is that idiomatic expressions come over a little bit strained, and there's kind of strange structures in the and readability kind of suffers a little bit as well. But on the positive side, it allows you to say, you know, the Greek word underlying this word is this, or the Hebrew word underlying this word is this, and you can go to lexicons, Bible study aids, and find what the original Hebrew word was, what the original Greek word was, depending on which testament you're in, and you know what you're working with. Listed in the notebook are some examples of the literal type of translation. I'll just let you look at those yourself. The dynamic equivalence, or thought for thought, they look at a phrase or a sentence in the original language and they try to render it with the same meaning in the target language. Not word for word, but thought for thought. So they're trying to capture the thoughts of the original. That makes it much more readable. Idioms can be translated from the original language into an idiom in the target language. So it makes sense. It sounds better to the ears of the reader. The problem comes in with it's a little bit less precise. Right? So you've got a little bit of trade-off. You've got readability on the dynamic equivalence, and you've got precision on the word for word. There's a trade-off there. There are some, like if you look at that chart, you will see that some of them are called balanced, which means that they do some word for word, some thought for thought. I don't know how you. Where do you draw a line there between the dynamic equivalence and what they call a balance? I'm not sure, but you'll see that terminology out there. The third type of English version is a paraphrase. Paraphrase, of course, isn't a translation at all. It's the same story retold in somebody else's words. There's no reference to the original texts. It's just being told in a readable fashion to kind of make it exciting, if you want to think of it that way. There's a very popular paraphrase that's out there right now called The Message. There are a lot of children's Bibles are paraphrases. There are some others. But because paraphrases depend very heavily on somebody's, and it's usually just one person, somebody's understanding, somebody's opinion, really is what it boils down to. it is not something that we recommend, really. We would recommend a translation, whether that's a dynamic equivalence or a word for word. A translation is going to carry over God's word, the original word, better. So what's the, we get asked this all the time, what's the best translation? What's the right translation? Well, there aren't any perfect ones. Both the literal and the dynamic equivalents have a place. There isn't any version that's perfect. There isn't even any agreement on what perfect would be. You know, people disagree about that. So, you know, we suggest that you have more than one version, especially if you come across something that you're not understanding, check it out in another version. Especially if you have a dynamic equivalence version and a word-for-word translation, both, you'll get good results. Great.
Paul.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In this literal and dynamic, in these categories, are you listing them according to when they appeared? Or did they appear to someone? No particular order.
No particular order.
Okay. Thank you.
King James was first. New American Standard came before New King James. English Standard definitely came later. I think the rest of them might be in order in the literal. Dynamic equivalence, actually the dates are probably on that chart, so that would be more. So under the dynamic equivalence, the New English Bible, that one is clearly the oldest of the ones that are listed. The other ones I think were probably in order. So yeah, there was no particular order plan there.
The whole one was
Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. We are on page 39 in your notebook, and we're going to look at Bible Themes 3. So the third time we've looked at Bible Themes, and tonight we're going to look at promises. When we think about one of the characteristics of God presented in the Bible, He is depicted as a God of promise. So there are evidences of Him in the Bible keeping His short-term promises, which leads more evidence to the fact that He will keep His short-term or His long-term promise. So we get short-term examples, which helps us say, okay, if He does this short-term, then of course He's going to do the long-term promises as well. But first off, one of the big questions that a lot of people had is, does God even have a purpose? Did God have a purpose in creating mankind? Was there a purpose? And the answer is yes. So, okay, you got the answer, right? Well, let's look a little bit further. In Numbers 14, verse 21, God says, "But truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." So there is a purpose spelled out very clearly, very succinctly for us. Numbers 14:21. Now also, another place, the purpose is God going somewhere with creation. In Ephesians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, it says, "Making known to us the mystery of His will, according to His purpose, which He set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time, to unite all things in Him, things in heaven and things on earth." So there's a purpose, there's a plan, there's a uniting that is spoken about in Ephesians. And then the last piece of this, where we say, is God going somewhere with His creation? Is there a purpose? In 2 Peter 3, it says, "But according to His promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." So we've got Old Testament verse in Numbers, and then we've got two pieces, one in Ephesians, written by Paul, and then in 2 Peter, a passage written by Peter. So we've got this purpose, this pattern, or this purpose that is summarized for us, at least in these three different verses. But there are many more specific promises given, many more purposes given, but these are sort of three, let's call them highlights, giving us an overall intention of what God has in plan for the earth. What I want to look at next is actually one more piece. One more piece is something that you all know, the Lord's Prayer. Most everybody knows the Lord's Prayer. You know, our Father, I can't even think straight right now. I'm sorry, I've been moving people all day long, so I'm a little frazzled. But in the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew chapter 6, we read, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And then the end of it, yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. So something we all know, most of us know, something we all probably recite without even really thinking about it. I mean, I know growing up I did, I just said it. Didn't really think about what it says. But it is part of the purpose of God, part of the plan of God. So this, again, fills that picture out a little bit more if somebody says, does God have a purpose in creating mankind? God does have a purpose. This is sort of a summary of this first little piece. It does involve people. It involves a kingdom which will fill the earth with God's glory. And the promises in the Bible are related to a purpose. So we're going to take a look now at some of those promises that are there. The first promise is way back in Genesis 3, and we touched on this a little bit in week 1 when we did an overview of Genesis. We certainly didn't spend enough time on it then. We really won't spend a whole lot of time on it tonight, but I want you to think back to Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve first disobeyed, and we read that there. They sinned. They disobeyed God. They sinned. And when they did that, they forfeited the gift of life. You know, there were repercussions that Adam and Eve had because of the conditions that God placed on life. So this is a promise that's given at the time that this would happen. Because really, life was a trust. Life was conditional on obeying God. This is what Adam and Eve knew. And the penalty was the forfeiture of life. If you remember back in the second class, we talked about the nature of God. And as we talked about that, we talked about the fact that He's a merciful and a forgiving God. You know, way back here, way back in the beginning, there's disobedience. And yet we know God is a merciful and a forgiving God. So in reality, He could have taken their lives right then. He could have taken their lives right then. But He made a provision for them to ultimately escape death. Okay?
Permanent death.
Right. But let's just go with escape death right now. And so this is where, you know, the first key promise comes in. Genesis 3 tells us about the sin. It came about when a snake fooled Eve into eating fruit from a tree. The tree that God told them not to eat of. So this is what happens. And then Adam ate too. So Adam followed right after Eve. Then when they were confronted by God, they admitted what they had done. You know, it was pretty simple. And then God pronounces a sentence upon them, starting with a snake. So Genesis 3, starting verse 14, the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So this is a promise, a first promise that is made. Now, part of this is a little cryptic, and sometimes it can be a little hard to understand. But if you think it through, and you know, this is one of those things where we go through it tonight, and then you go home and you say, well, wait a minute, what was it that Ray was talking about? And you pull out your notebook and you look at it again, and you look up the passage, and just think about it a little bit more, because you know, we've got in this first promise, an offspring is promised to the woman. The offspring was going to be the mortal enemy of sin. So the snake, sin, the snake, and death. So the offspring of the snake. Okay? So stick with me here. Now, the outcome of all this is the victory of the woman's offspring and death to the snake. And then as it says here, human failure isn't going to derail this purpose of God. God has a purpose, which we already established. And yet there's human failure, but that doesn't mean God's purpose is going to change. God's purpose is still there. let's look now at Genesis 12. The first 3 verses and then 7. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I skipped one point. I'm sorry. As we look at this first promise, there's a lot of symbols involved. And when you think about most serious literature, there's always a lot of symbols or a lot of metaphors. So this is where, remember, I think it was in class 2, where we talked about how sometimes the Bible is difficult to understand. Here we've got a promise early on, but it's a little difficult to understand because of the symbols and the metaphors. But you can see in this message that ultimately there's a message of hope. God is providing a way to finally fulfill his purpose. And this eventual victory is the victory of sin over the consequences of sin. So this is a victory over sin and the consequences of these sins. So hope is given to Adam and Eve. There is this promise that's out there that God's law is going to be carried out and that they would have to die. They have to die. They have disobeyed God. But first they're going to live a life, and even though that life is going to be full of pain and frustration, there is going to be hope for them. Ultimate hope, long-term hope for them. So that's where we are with the first promise. Okay? Let's move on to another promise again, which we talked a little bit about. And really it's a set of promises that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promises that were given to them. We talked about this again a little bit in the overview of Genesis. But we're going to start out with Abram, and the promise was made to Abram. You'll see there in Genesis 12, Abram. I have a hard time saying Abram, so I just always say Abram. But it started out Abram, and then his name was changed. So if I say one or the other, that's just the way it is. But, you know, the reason that there were promises given to Abram was that he was faithful to God. He was faithful to God. In Genesis 12, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, I will make of you a great nation." So here's a promise. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Then the Lord appeared to Abram, this is verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So, Abram is going to be blessed, and he's going to be a blessing. All the people of the world are going to be blessed through Abram. And there's going to be an offspring given. Now this is a key point I want you to remember as I say it now, because I'm going to say this a few more times. We're going to talk about the offspring. Okay? But in this case, there's an offspring to whom the land is going to be given. Now, in Genesis 13, we go on and we see, "All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So the promise of the land is personally given to Abram. And it's to be given forever. This isn't a short-term promise we talked about early on. This is a long-term promise. Forever is a long-term, long time. And there's going to be this huge, huge multitude of offspring that he's going to have. Okay? So these are promises to Abraham. Now, these promises of the land, these promises of the seed are actually repeated to Abraham in Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 as well. And his name is actually then changed to Abraham. So we can talk about that later, the reason for the name change. Let's look at the next point is in Genesis 22, starting in verse 17, more promises to Abraham. "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So we've got two new elements here. We've got this offspring, where it says his enemies, singular, his enemies, to possess the gate of his enemies and to be victorious. And now there's a way for all nations to be blessed through Abraham And that's through his seed, through the seed. So keep thinking about the seed, keep thinking about the offspring. Let me pause a minute and catch my breath here and make sure I'm in the right place on my notes. So these promises to Abraham, we've got seed, we've got offspring, we've got a multitude, we've got a specific seed, individual seed, which again we'll carry that through in a moment. We've got blessings on all nations through Abraham and through his seed, and then we've got this land promised forever. Now, these promises to Abraham were also repeated, as I said earlier, to his son Isaac, and then to his grandson Jacob. So we've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And these promises just keep being repeated. Just as a reminder, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So when you say, where does the name of Israel come from? Jacob, just like Abram was changed to Abraham, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Again, we can talk about why at some other point. But this entire line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob became the nation of Israel. Part of them becoming the nation of Israel was a partial fulfillment of some of these promises. A partial fulfillment, but not the entire fulfillment, because remember, it says forever, and we're not at forever yet. So we've got a partial fulfillment that's a preliminary and really an incomplete promise fulfilled so far. Okay, we looked at Adam and Eve. We looked at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We're going to look at another promise now. Promise to David. So we're going to look at King David, and actually King David is another faithful man. Remember we talked about how faithful Abraham was. David is also a faithful man, and David is actually called by God a man after his own heart, after my own heart. So I always think, wouldn't that be a nice thing to have on your tombstone? You know, for God to say, he's a man after my own heart. I mean, this is who David is. This is who David is. So there are promises made to David. Let me take you back a moment in time just in our Bible history. For centuries, the center of worship for Israel was in a tent, the tabernacle. And it was constructed when Israel was in the wilderness. David says, I want to make a permanent structure. I want to make a permanent structure and a house for God. So David decides he's going to do this, but as it says on the screen, God's response, good thought, but your son's going to do that. It's not going to be you. And Nathan the prophet is actually the one who is sent to David to tell him this. And Nathan the prophet is also the one that goes on to tell him the next point, part of the promise, which is in 1 Chronicles 17, I will make for you a name, this is again to David, I will make for you a name like the name of the great ones of the earth, and I will appoint a place for my people. Israel, I will, back up. I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. Moreover, I will declare to you that the Lord will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled to walk with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring, remember offspring, after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. So God is going to say to David, Israel is going to be a peace forever. Israel's a peace forever. God is going to make a house or a dynasty for David. This is part of the promises to David. After David's dead, there's going to be this seed born. So remember, we keep talking about seed and offspring. This seed is one who sits on David's throne as a king forever, we just read. And this offspring is going to build a house for God. So a household for God. And then also David's son, which we just read, David's son is also to be God's son. Okay? Interesting promises that God is making to David. Now, part of when we look at this, we've got this special seed. Remember, Abraham is descended from Eve. David is descended from Abraham. So this promised offspring is coming through this line, coming through from Adam and Eve to Abraham, we're down to David. And this seed or this offspring they're dealing with sin and death. They're going to inherit the land forever and reign as king forever. So see, these are some aspects of these promises that are flowing down from the different individuals, the promises we've talked about. Okay? Are you following me? Somewhat? Okay, because we're covering a lot of information here. A lot of information. Now, the next piece is the New Testament makes it clear that the Old Testament has everything to do with the Christian hope. So, we come to the New Testament in Luke and the angel Gabriel. Gabriel speaks to Mary and says, Mary, you are going to be the woman. The Messiah is getting ready to be born. The angel announces that she is going to be the woman who bears this seed. Again, we keep talking about this seed. The angel also mentions to Mary every aspect of the promise to David. And this is, and we're not going to read we're not going to read Luke 1, but I don't know if that's in your text.
Yes.
Is it there somewhere? I haven't seen it.
Yes.
Okay, you tell me it's there. It's fine. Good. So Gabriel's mentioning these things to Mary, and says this child is to be born, and we know this child is Jesus, and he is fulfillment of the promise. So we've got Old Testament promises now being connected to the New Testament hope through Mary and ultimately through Jesus. The next piece of this connection between the Old Testament promises and the Christian hope is in Galatians 3. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So we've got, actually we'll go on and continue reading this. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say into offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one. So again, think seed, think offspring that we've been talking about. And to your offspring, who is Christ, singular. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. So, seed, an offspring that's Christ, singular, but then we've got all of us. We've got multiple. So again, it's sort of a little confusing when you think about singular and multiple all together. But as we take these promises that have flown through the Old Testament and go on into the New Testament, it starts to flow together and it starts to be explained very clearly in the New Testament. The last couple points I want to make in this section, and I know it's been I think a little bit difficult section, but you've got the notes in your notebook to go through. But we've got this gospel. Gospel is in the promises to Abraham. So the gospel is the good news of the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ. All the way back to Abraham. Blessings come to all of us through Jesus. Again, re-emphasizing the singular seed as well as many, and that Christians are the heirs of these promises. Part of the promises, the land forever. Remember, we've talked about that with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So to finish up, let's read this passage in 2 Peter 1. His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of Him who called us to His own glory and excellence, by which He has granted to us His precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. That is part of the defeat of the snake, part of the defeat and the overcoming of sin. This helps to bring it all to a close, bring it all together. So we all partake of this divine nature together, and to do that, sin and death have to be removed from us. They have to be removed from us. So we saw, let's actually, you just said that. So the last piece is uniting us with God. Remember we read that in Ephesians chapter 1. We read about this uniting with God and the removal of the barrier of sin and death. We read about in Numbers 14, filling the earth with God's glory. So that part of that is the gift of the land. And then finally we read about the forever piece. And in order to have forever, heirs of these promises have to be immortal. This has to last forever. So, a lot of information there in that section, and we can talk about that later if you want to, but we need to keep moving on here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Paul and let him take the wheel.
Well, it's obvious to Ray and I, even if it isn't to you, that we're not going to get through everything tonight. So we may want to start thinking about adding a 7th week. I don't know if you guys are up for that.
I mean, hey, we're going to be having a second week.
Right. So Norms has to carry over into that following week also because of his trip to Turkey. So anyway, we told you, right? Week 1, right on the very first little section, I said, you're guinea pigs, and so are we. So, okay, well, we're at our next Books of the Bible section, which starts on page 42, the summaries of the books from this section. Now, you notice it jumps in with Jeremiah and Zephaniah and Habakkuk. It doesn't jump in with any historical books, and that's because we already looked earlier at 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, right? So the history of this period is in 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles, but the summaries of those books are earlier in your notebook. So what we're going to be...
One of the authors is our current president.
No. So last week we left off with the elimination of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, right? The Assyrians came in, took the northern kingdom away. They're gone. They're out of the land. So this is where we finished up last week. Tonight we're going to be looking at the remaining kings of Judah. We're actually going to be covering a 700-year period, but don't be too worried because 400 years of that we have no Bible text. So, so it's only 300 years worth of the Bible. So we're going to be looking at the remaining kings of Judah, the captivity of Judah, the return from captivity, and then everything after that up until Jesus. And that last book will be quite short. So we saw last week that the nation of Assyria was used by God as his means to judge the northern kingdom of Israel. He used the Assyrians to punish them. Well, the Assyrians also invaded Judah. Hezekiah was king of Judah at this time. They invaded Judah. They took most of it. They could not take Jerusalem. They never took Jerusalem. You may have heard of the story of Sennacherib's army. So Sennacherib is the Assyrian emperor, and he sends his people to threaten Jerusalem.
Where's that word at, Sennacherib?
That will be probably in the earlier sections. Actually, yeah, it's going to be in the earlier section. Sorry, because the Kings and Chronicles we covered earlier, it's going to be, his name will be mentioned there.
How do you spell that?
SENN. ACHERIB. Okay, so he's the guy, and he sends his army commanders to threaten Jerusalem and to give them the message, hey, the gods of all the people have fallen before me. There is no God that can protect you from me. And Hezekiah gets this message and he takes the message to God. The account says that the prophet Isaiah brought the answer, and here's the answer from God to what Sennacherib has said. Thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake, and for the sake of my servant David. And the angel of the Lord went forth and slew 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. And the army never came to Jerusalem. They never besieged Jerusalem. Now, this is a pretty remarkable statement, right? This angel coming and killing 185,000? Well, it's not, they don't exactly say the same thing because they don't want to give too much credit to the God of Israel. But Sennacherib's own record of this event, plus a contemporary Egyptian record of the same era, back this story up. And Sennacherib left. He left town. He left Judah completely. And the parts of it that he had taken reverted to the Jewish control. This is a graphic example of deliverance by God of the people who are faithful to him. Hezekiah was a very good king, a very faithful king. And God heard his prayers, heard his, when he brought this to God. Well, in the verse right before this passage, so just, you know, if we had turned it up, I would have you just lift your eyes an inch and look at the verse that comes right before it, because this is what God says through Isaiah. For out of Jerusalem shall go
Yeah,
forth.
where are you? I'm lost.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Where's Isaiah? We're talking about
It's
Isaiah.
not, what's in your notebooks is the summaries of the books, okay? So the books of the Bible section, that's how they are all set up. It's the summaries of the books. We are in, that's why I mentioned at the
Are we
beginning.
on
we're-
page 42 still?
That's where it starts. That's where all of this
Okay,
starts, okay?
okay.
We haven't been going through all the material in the notebook,
Okay,
and we aren't tonight either.
okay.
We aren't going to be going through all that material. That's reference material for you.
And we don't have this material.
So you don't have this material in the notebook.
Oh, that's what I'm looking
That has
for.
been true for all of the books of the Bible sections. What's been on the screen has not been in the notebook.
Always been in the notebook, okay.
So, sorry about that. So so we had this promise by God, and what happened? The verse right before, God says through Isaiah, "For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion. The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this." This is a theme. This is one instance of a theme, this theme of the remnant. You're going to want to watch for it as you read the Old Testament prophets. So that's where the books that in the notebook are the prophetic books. So in Isaiah and in many of the other prophetic books, this idea of a remnant, a saved remnant, a remainder that gets saved, that's something to watch for. It's a theme that runs especially through the prophetic books. So God says over and over that he's going to judge his people, and he does, but he never wipes them out. Right? He always preserves this remnant, and he delivers the remnant. So that's just something to watch for. Okay, well, Hezekiah was followed by two very wicked men, his son Manasseh and his grandson Ammon. And it's because of the wickedness of Manasseh that God tells them that their nation is going to be taken into captivity. It is specifically because of Manasseh and his legacy. That was foretold by Isaiah, then later on by Jeremiah. Their wickedness was going to bring judgment. And the fact that they were God's people, and they didn't stop being God's people, but the fact that they were God's people was not going to prevent them from being judged by God. So he was going to hold them accountable. Well, it turns out that Manasseh does repent in this marvelous turnaround after 50 plus years of being a horribly corrupt, murderous autocrat. He repents. He turns around. And it's a remarkable thing. But I think it's because of his turnaround that God gives Judah one more chance. And that chance is not Ammon. Ammon is horrible. After only 2 years, he's assassinated. And his son Josiah then becomes the king, and he's another really good king. He's very faithful. He leads a reformation throughout Judah. They destroy all the idolatrous altars and the idols. They crush them and get rid of them. Unfortunately, it's just Josiah. He's on the right beam. But the people, they are so corrupted by what Manasseh has introduced. They don't really reform. So there's this great reformation attempted by Josiah, but it doesn't take. But this becomes then Judah's last chance. They blow it, this gift of God for a last chance, and the next 4 kings are wicked and short-lived. Babylon is then the next empire. They conquer the Assyrian Empire. So on this map, Babylon's down here, Assyria's up here. Babylon conquers Assyria. Well, Assyria controls God's land by now, so they also take that. Now, Judah, little Judah down at the bottom here, they had never been conquered by Assyria, but Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, he comes and he does conquer Jerusalem and Judah. The record says that God tried very hard to get his people to turn around, but they wouldn't. Here's what God says through Jeremiah. I have persistently sent all my servants the prophets to them day after day, yet they did not listen to me. This is the nation that did not obey the voice of the Lord their God and did not accept discipline. Truth has perished, it is cut off from their lips. Notice that there are 2 really serious, fatal problems, right? They don't do right, they're morally corrupt, and they abandon truth. Okay, both of those things are real problems. God depicts himself as the righteous God. He depicts himself as the God of truth. So these are serious problems, and they are the reason, God sent his prophets over and over again, as Jeremiah says. They wouldn't have it.
So I wonder what kind of sins they were doing that were so bad. I mean, like
read Jeremiah.
Adultery.
Read Jeremiah.
Jeremiah.
Yep. You will get a vast amount of detail, more than I could summarize in 30 seconds I might take to answer that question.
Well, of course, ones that come to my mind is adultery, murder, coveting wives,
all of that. Also lies, corrupting doctrine, teaching lies instead of God's truth.
Right, yeah.
He really gets after the prophets and the priests who were false prophets and corrupt priests. A lot of that. Sorry, it's 52 chapters long, but you'll get all you will get the whole picture if you read Jeremiah.
Okay.
And actually Ezekiel, who's contemporary, he has a lot of the same things to say. Okay, well, Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered, as we mentioned. He was actually a pretty tolerant guy. He was much better than the Assyrians. Remember, the Assyrians had this policy of pulling people out of their homes and putting other people in. Nebuchadnezzar didn't do that. The Babylonians didn't do that. What he did was he took some members of the nobility captive. That included Daniel, who went into captivity. And he left local rulers in charge, but they rebelled against him, so he had to come back. So he took more hostages, you know, from the nobility. That included Ezekiel. He went with the second wave. Well, they rebelled again. So finally, as basically a last resort, he just came through, he sacked Jerusalem, he destroyed the city, he destroyed the temple, he took a much larger number of people away, carried them into Babylon, and left Jerusalem in ruins. This is called the captivity. It usually spelled with a capital C. So if you see that term written anywhere, this is what it's about. Well, several of the prophets that we've mentioned fit into this period. So there's Zephaniah and Jeremiah and Habakkuk before the captivity. Jeremiah actually spans across. He continues his preaching into the time after the captivity. We mentioned that Daniel and Ezekiel were taken captive, and then after Judah returns, they stay in captivity for 70 years, and then after they return, as promised. Jeremiah had actually laid out the exact time period. He said it's going to be 70 years, and then you're going to come back, and that's what happened. After the return were Haggai and Zechariah, and then later on comes Malachi. So that's the rest of the prophets of the Old Testament that we hadn't already touched on. So we touched on a bunch of them last week, some more this week. Well, the Babylonian Empire was overtaken by the Medo-Persian Empire, as Daniel said it would be. Cyrus, the Persian emperor, decreed that the Jews could go back home. They could, all the captives, if they wanted to, they could go back home. And so Zerubbabel and Joshua, the governor and the high priest, lead the first group back, and they rebuild the temple. They build a new temple. It's called the Second Temple, kind of for obvious reasons. That's recorded in Ezra. And then a little later, Ezra and Nehemiah come along. Ezra is a teaching priest, and he comes back and teaches them the law because they really still weren't doing too good. Then Nehemiah comes back. He's actually a high official in the Persian court. He comes back and he rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem so it's inhabitable again. Somewhere in this period, we don't know exactly when, but the story of Queen Esther comes in this time. She is the queen of Persia, married to the Persian emperor, and she is instrumental in thwarting a plot against to exterminate the Jews. Sound familiar? You know, people have been trying to exterminate the Jews for a long, long time. But this plot is thwarted, and the Jewish feast of Purim, which perhaps you have heard of, is the celebration of this deliverance. And then we mentioned that the last book of the Old Testament, the last one to be written, was the prophecy of Malachi. And then there's that 400-year period of silence that I mentioned, right? There's nothing in the Bible from Malachi at 400 BC until the Gospels in the New Testament. So there's a 400-year gap. But that doesn't mean history didn't keep going. History marches on, right? So not in the Bible, but from secular history, we know that Greece conquered Persia, Alexander the Great. And then the kingdom was split up. There was the period of the Maccabees. Then Rome conquered Greece. During that time, Herod the Great built a spectacular temple in Jerusalem, a temple for the God of Israel. And during that period of time between the Testaments, that's when the religious system that's in place that Jesus confronts in the Gospels that we read, which we'll be talking about next week, the system comes together during this time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So the synagogue system gets started. The religious political parties that we run into in the New Testament are formed. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So all of that gets set up in the time between the Testaments. Well, based on the prophecies of David in the Psalms, and Isaiah and Daniel and Malachi and some others, the Jewish people were in a state of high expectation of Messiah coming. So there were all these prophecies of Messiah, and they could look around them and see it looks like this should be the time. Messiah is coming. So they were in expectation. This will be something for you to watch for as you read the Gospels and Acts. Look for the clues that show how expectant the people were, how much they were expecting Messiah to come. They were just at a fever pitch, ready for him to come. And indeed he came. But it wasn't only Israel that was ready and waiting for Messiah. It's a little less obvious, but the rest of the world was in good shape for the rise and the spread of Christianity. Thanks to the Greeks, there was a universal language. Everybody spoke Greek. That made it possible to spread the gospel very easily. Thanks to the Romans, there was general peace, right? The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, right? The whole Mediterranean area, they had subdued, and it really was at peace. And they were keeping pirates under control. They were keeping highway robbers under control. They built a tremendous highway system. Really facilitated the spread of the gospel. And also, both Greece and Rome tolerated religious diversity. So initially, the early church did not have to deal with widespread persecution. Now that came later. And local persecution happened from the get-go. But widespread systematic persecution didn't start until later. And a big part of that was the religious tolerance that was there. So this made it possible for Christianity to spread. And so the scene is set for the New Testament period. We're going to talk about that next week. And right now, back to Rick. Good luck.
Okay, we'll see if we can finish up close to being on time. Good luck. What we're going to look at tonight is the reading tip number 4. The Bible interprets itself. Okay, so that's the big umbrella. The Bible interprets itself, and we're going to look at 3 different points as we go through this tonight. So, what page is that, Michael?
50.
50. Page 50, okay. Page 50 in your notebook is where we are. Let me turn to that so I have it in front of me too. So, first off, a lot of times when you're studying the Bible, you say, okay, you hear a verse here, you hear a verse here, you hear a verse here, they all sort of get strung together. That's not a good way to study. Now, unfortunately, we have to do a little bit of that in our class because we're trying to give you an overview and trying to go through a lot of information really quickly. But always beware when people are saying, well, this verse, this verse, this verse, this verse, because you say, okay, there's a lot more to it than just pulling out verses. So, again, we have to do it a little bit, but we hope that you're here you want to understand how to read the whole Bible and not just little snippets. So that's sort of a little cautionary point. As we think about this passage and we think about this idea, this tip, how the Bible interprets itself, really to a huge extent, the Bible will explain itself to you. You don't have to go out and get this and that and all this other stuff. The Bible does it for you. There's a lot of commentaries on the Bible that are available. There are a lot of study Bibles which have commentaries built in. I actually used a study Bible for a few years and finally I said, you know what, the problem is I'm looking at those notes there first instead of doing my own study. So I got a new Bible here a year or 2 ago that doesn't have any of that, and I find it so much better because it causes me to have to dig a little deeper and figure it out for myself. Because when I do, I learn so much more. Because the problem with the commentaries, whether it's in your Bible, in a study Bible, or whether you go out and look at a commentary, it's one person's opinion. Now, they may have a very valid opinion. It may be right, but it could also be wrong. Because when you read a lot of commentaries, one person will say this and another person says this. So who's right? So a lot of times you need to figure it out for yourself. There's a verse in Acts 17 that said, the Bereans searched the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And that's sort of my motto, my theme verse is, I need to search out the scriptures myself, not let somebody else tell me what it says. So whatever Paul and I are up here telling you, I'll say take it with a grain of salt. You know, I say that sort of lightly, but you need to figure these things out. You know, and that's, I think, one reason why you're here, because you're wanting to figure that out. You're wanting to know a little bit more. So we're trying to help you effectively learn to read the Bible, effectively how to start reading the Bible. There's actually a course that we offer called How to Study the Bible, which takes you deeper than this class does. We're sort of giving you a big, broad overview. So keep an eye out for that coming up later. But just what we want to do tonight is we're looking at Bible tips, is teach you, like I said, 3 different techniques to think of. So, first off, slow down and read carefully. Because just that in itself, the Bible isn't meant for speed reading. You know, there's a lot of information there. Some of it is easier to read through quickly and get it than others. I mean, you've got poetry, you've got prose, you've got essays, you've got all these different pieces. Sometimes you can go through fairly quickly, and sometimes it's too much to do that. That's one suggestion I have is, if you haven't done it, just to read the whole Bible once. It gives you a big, broad overview. But then to make your notes, to have your questions, and then go back and give it a second reading. Some of the passages deserve a second and a third and a fourth reading. I always think to myself, this passage, this book, this chapter, whatever, it's in the Bible for a reason. God's put it here. I just read it, and I don't know what that reason is, but it's here for a reason, so I need to go back and I need to think about it again. I need to slow down. I once tried to read the Bible in 90 days, and I got it done, and then I said, okay, what was that? You know, it's like, yeah, great, I check it off my list, but so what? Need to slow down and spend time looking at the Bible. The next technique is paying attention to context. You know, politicians always complain about sound bites, right? You know, they say something and the news pulls it out and say, oh, look what they said. It's like, no, can't do that. And a lot of times Scripture is the same way. You can turn up a verse and you can say, oh, look what that little piece says right there. Well, you don't really know what's happening, so you need to look at context. You need to look at the verses right before, the verses right after, the chapters before, the chapters right after. Excuse me. You need to have an idea of what's happening in the political scene, in the cultural scene. You know, and it takes time to get to that point. But context is incredibly important. You know, Jesus, after telling some of his parables, you know, if you just sat there and read that parable, you'd say, what is he talking about? But Jesus then turns around and explains it. You know, we said the Bible interprets itself. A lot of times in those parables, Jesus goes right on and says, let me tell you what I just said. But he tells you these parables just to help us with those little short stories. Another way to let the Bible explain itself is, we talked about echoes a few weeks ago, listening for echoes. You know, you say, oh, I've heard that somewhere before. Where was that? When you do that, one good way to do that and help yourself is to have that notebook that I talked about and write your questions, write your thoughts down. First off, when you write it down, it's just going to sink in a little bit deeper. But then if you have that, I know Geraldine a lot of times has a notebook and will write down things, and I'm always like, what's she writing over there? But you know, it's always good because then you can go back and look at it, and when that echo pops up, you say, okay, that makes sense. But there's another way to do that. It's to use somebody else's echoes that they've heard. And those are cross-references. In your Bible, in my Bible, if I look it up and just turn it and open it up, and I'll just turn over here, wherever. In the center section, there are cross-references. A lot of times there's center cross-references. Sometimes they're in the bottom, sometimes they're over on the side, but cross-references are people's own echoes. Somebody has said, this verse connects to this verse. Now, sometimes, when that happens, sometimes, remember we talked about 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles being parallel accounts that sort of filled in the blanks for each other? Well, sometimes if you're in 1st Chronicles, you'll see a cross-reference to 1st Kings. because it fills in a little bit more of the story. It's a parallel account. In the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are the same telling of the same event that's told a little bit differently. Partly because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were writing to different audiences. But they saw things from a little bit different perspective. Same things happening, but they fill it in a little bit more. So those cross-references a lot of times will do that for you. Cross-references also in the New Testament a lot of times will point back to the verse that was quoted, that's being quoted in the New Testament. I think there's an example, there on the bottom of page 50 in Matthew 2. There's a passage here, and in verse 6, it says, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah." And so then the arrow there that you see, it goes down and says, verse 6, the cross-reference, one of the cross-references is Micah 5:2. That's where it's being quoted from. So you say, okay, why was this being quoted? Well, maybe you have to go back and look at the context of Micah 5:2 and say, what's happening there that made this all fit? But a lot of times, especially around the birth of Jesus, when there's a lot of fulfilled prophecy about Bethlehem and about Mary and a virgin, well, those cross-references will take you back to the Old Testament where those quotes in the New Testament are from. With the cross-references also, the last thing that's there with that is a lot of times it's a key word, and I don't know if this is true. Remember last week we talked about the charcoal fire I talked about with Peter, and I don't know if it's in there or not, but maybe if I was writing my own cross-reference in John 21 where it talks about the charcoal fire, I would write a cross-reference there back to John 18 and say there's the other time charcoal is used. So a lot of times when you see that cross-reference and you take it back and you look at it and say, why was that cross-reference there? A lot of times it's a key word that is used in one place and the other, both places. Sometimes you look at cross-references and you say, I don't know why that's a cross-reference. Now, there's a reason. Somebody thought it fit there. And sometimes you may not see it the first time. But sometimes you have to look at multiple cross-references to help clarify the point that's being made in one place and connecting it back to the other. So cross-references and context and echoes and letting the Bible explain itself, which I think that's sort of our summary. Reading carefully, those are all incredibly important as we look for the Bible to interpret itself.
Very good.
Okay, I felt like I just ran the marathon again.
How'd that go?
We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
So,
I think, we will not, I had a few words to say on the next section, which is the role of prophecy, but I think we're going to just wait on that for next week. So we will see how things go in these last 2 weeks and whether we got through, I was surprised, we got through actually both of those last two segments. So we may not need to extend this. We'll see how it goes in the next 2 weeks. But there we're going to wrap it up for this week. And you can come up and look at the translation comparison chart. You can look at some of the maps. We looked at those. You can pick our brains, right? That's what we're here for. And for Geraldine and Larry, I have some notebook pages for you. Everybody else has the new notebook pages, right? I think it was just you. So, Ray, you want to close with a prayer?